Hi, it's Heart Love, everyone. So, we're here for the first reading and first chapter of Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare. We're going to go through chapter 1. I'm your moderator and narrator, Uriel, Neveu, Riley. So, get comfortable. Peace, feast, YouTube. Here we go. We already went through the preface, the preface. So now we are beginning chapter 1. Thank you all for being here and reading with us for the new book for this month. Chapter 1, the Healthcare Delivery Problem. Poverty is an obvious factor in the problem of providing adequate health care. Not so obvious, however, are the difficulties of communicating the health needs of the underprivileged to those in a position to do something about it. A good example of this is the problem of rats, a subject which induced a great deal of laughter when it was introduced in Congress in 1968. Rats, however, are no laughing matter. Since the beginning of the 20th century, it has been known that the fleas which live on infected rats are the common carriers of bubonic plague. Rat populations the world over are carefully watched. The United States has been lucky in that it has never suffered a severe epidemic of the plague, although the bacillus is known to have entered this country in 1900 and to have caused the death of 113 people over a 4-year period in San Francisco. Today, plague is endemic in the southwestern parts of the United States, but the chief animal vectors are squirrels and rabbits, and Americans have continued to be less concerned about rats than most other peoples. The lack of governmental concern has led to rats becoming a serious environmental hazard to the poor who inhabit the slums. Peace. The This occurs because while it is possible for individual homeowners rather easily to rid their property of rats, tenants in large buildings are dependent upon the owners or managers of the building. In the older buildings, even this is not enough because rats have established nests and roots inside the walls, under the flooring, and in the basement. And if one landowner mounts an effective program, the rats simply flee to a neighboring building. To be really effective, a rat control program has to involve governmental action on a large scale. Because such programs are usually lacking, it has become necessary to give welfare recipients in some of the large cities small supplementary rat allowances to enable them to keep their lights burning all night to frighten away the rats. Such allowances, however, are at best a makeshift solution. The danger that rats pose to children was learned by one of the authors of this book from personal experience. We include it because it exemplifies a type of healthcare problem which does not touch the affluent members of society and because it emphasizes the communication gap between the rich and the poor. Part of this anecdote is written in the first person because it was taken from the notes kept while the author served as a public health nurse in the early 1950s on Chicago's South Side. Peace, highest heart, love, guys. All right, so now we're reading into the story. In 1953, rats mutilated and killed an infant in the area next to the district in which I was working. In my own district, they chewed the hand of a small black newborn infant named William Henry. William's mother and four siblings lived in a dugout basement under a dilapidated row house. Mrs. Henry had been awakened in the middle of the night by the cries of her baby and found two huge gray rats on top of him. When she snatched him up, his hand was bleeding, mass of mangled flesh. She took her baby to Cook County Hospital for emergency care. Cook County, however, was more than an hour away by bus, and in order to get there, she borrowed money from the neighbors to take a taxi. Because she was afraid to leave her other four children alone at home, she took all of them with her, and they spent the night in the emergency room, waiting for the baby to be treated and admitted. Most of William's hand could be saved, although he lost the distal portion of the three fingers. When William was discharged from the hospital, the health department was notified. I was sent to visit the family. I found them living in a basement, which had probably never been meant to be used as a residence. Most of the houses in this particular area had been built in 60 or 70 years earlier, long before electrical outlets were a standard feature in a home, and when food storage posed serious problems. The basements in these houses had been designed to store food and coal, and the original owners probably never thought of these dugouts as a possible residence. It obviously was not suitable place for five children to live. I felt the rats would again attack the infant unless something was done. I called the office on the city housing inspector, met with the officials in the urban renewal office, and had long discussions with my own supervisor. In spite of all my efforts, some of which became quite frantic, no public official could be into doing anything about the rats, and there seemed to be no other housing available at the level the Henry family could afford. Rather, it should be said there was a low income housing available in Chicago at the time, but it was not available to Negroes, even Negroes who were quite well to do. The Chicago ghetto had burst the officially imposed boundaries in the years following the 1947 U.S. Supreme Court decision that made restrictive covenants unenforceable. Even with the help of the ever present blockbusters, the informal pressure against integration in housing or a rapid expansion of the ghetto had kept the Black Belt much too small for the number of people seeking housing. This meant that housing for Negroes rented at about twice the price per room of that available for white families. Inevitably, landlords broke up apartments into smaller and smaller units, rented out storage areas, and expected several families to share a bathroom and kitchen. Mrs. Henry lived in this ghetto, and like many of her neighbors, she was on welfare. Her welfare checks were smaller than those of families of comparable size because she had tried to keep the arrival of her new baby a secret. She was convinced that her social worker would cut her off aid entirely if it became known that she had conceived again without finding a stable male breadwinner for the family. The house above the Henrys' basement was scheduled to be torn down as part of a large urban renewal project. The official at the Office of Urban Renewal, whom I contacted, explained that his department might eventually use its influence to place the Henrys in public housing, since finding other kinds of replacement housing for such a large family on the open market at a price they could afford was next to impossible. The official, however, refused to speed up the process or even let Mrs. Henry know that she had a chance to obtain public housing because he felt it would be bad for the neighborhood morale. He explained to me that the only way to get those old mamas off their cans was to frighten them with the bulldozer. He stated there were not enough public housing units to accommodate all the people who were displaced by the urban renewal projects, so that his job of finding replacement housing was much easier if he could convince the people in the buildings, which were scheduled to be cleared, that they would have to find an apartment for themselves or face the prospect of being in the house when the wrecking crew arrived. Sheesh. Most of the tenants in the house, when the wrecking, most of the tenants in the buildings, which already had been raised, had relocated themselves by moving into other slum housing or doubling up with relatives. The doubling up had added to the slum problem by creating the overcrowding, which is a major factor in the rapid deterioration of the central city ghetto housing. Not only does such crowding rapidly wear out a building, but when large numbers of families use a single facility, such as a kitchen, it is difficult to fix responsibility for keeping the area clean or repaired. As far as rats were concerned, the slum clearance project was a major factor in creating the problem in the first place. This is because the large luxury buildings being built on the cleared land were virtually rat proof. The displaced rats, just as the displaced people, made their way into nearby slum areas. Because of increased concentration, the appetites of the rats soon outstripped the available uncollected garbage supplies, and they turned to attacking infants in their cribs. Several families in the area had built heavy screen cages over the children's beds, and sometimes at night they would hear rats gnawing on the screens. Mrs. Henry, however, lacked money to buy screens and apparently also had little talent as a carpenter. After the baby came home from the hospital, she tried to keep it herself awake at night to guard him, but soon a state of chronic exhaustion made this difficult. In a desperate attempt to do something constructive to help her out, I begged two half grown cats from another family I knew and took them to her. Before a week was past, the rats had eaten the cats. Poverty and ethnic identity. The Henry family was black and poor. This particular combination of circumstances rendered them relatively powerless to deal with their problem. Affluent Negro families could afford somewhat better housing, while poor white families could secure much better housing for the same amount of money. Because the Henrys were poor, they had no family doctor, and because they were black, no Southside emergency room would then treat them. They would not treat William. These two factors, poverty and a minority status, are implicated in numerous ways in the present crisis in healthcare. Although poverty is probably the most important variable because Healthcare is still regarded as a commodity to be purchased on the open market. Membership in a low status minority group adds another dimension to the problem when it comes to achieving good health or obtaining health service. Not only in discrimination is discrimination present in the delivery of health service, but there is also discrimination in the recruitment of health workers. This further adds to the difficulty because the social distance between the worker, who is a member of the dominant group, and the minority patient often creates a barrier to communication. Moreover, poverty itself is frequently a product of discrimination in education and in hiring, so that the variables of poverty and minority status become closely interrelated. In parts of this book, poverty and ethnic identity will be separated conceptually, but it is important to realize that in the real world, the separation is not so easy to make. Peace, guys. Hi, it's Heart Love. Thank you for reading with us. Yes. Poverty, ethnic identity, and healthcare. How needed this is right now. We're in the first chapter, down in the bottom of page 5. Poverty indexes. In 1965, the Social Security Administration developed an index to measure the economic well being of families, with the result that poverty could be stated in somewhat more scientific terms. The index took into account such factors as the size and the composition of the family, and whether it lived in an urban or rural setting. For a non farm family of four, the poverty level was pegged at approximately $3,335 in 1966, or about three times the minimum amount it was calculated that it would cost to feed them. The dollar income for farm families was slightly lower because it was assumed that farmers had other food resources available to them. Slightly above the poverty level was a second category of near poor families whose income in urban areas was above $3,335,000 but below $4,345. Calculations were made to adjust the index back to 1959 so that comparisons over a decade were possible, and year by year adjustments are made in the index to keep it up to date and to allow for changes in the cost of living. With the use of this index, it was estimated that in 1959 there were 38.9 million Americans in some 13.4 million families who were classified as poor. By 1969, the number had fallen to 24.3 million persons in 5 million families. The drop was due to the relatively high employment rates during that decade. But not surprisingly, the people who left the ranks of the poor were usually young, white, healthy adults. This meant that, comparatively, the number of low income persons who were unskilled, chronically ill, or were members of minority groups increased proportionately. Large numbers of those classified as poor were under 18 or over 64. The older people are more likely to live alone, and the children are more likely to be members of families larger than the United States average. Nearly half of the family units which were classified at or below the poverty line were headed by a woman. This indicates that most of the people who are classified as poor would not be helped by a simple expansion of our economy because they tend to be unavailable for better paying work, either because of their age, family responsibilities, poor health, lack of ability, or the barriers of discrimination. In 1959, non white families made up about one fourth of the families classified as poor, but count, at latest count, they made up approximately one third. Though the majority of poor and near poor are still white, including Appalachian residents, Mexican Americans, and some Puerto Ricans, members of non white minority groups, particularly Negroes and Indians, are overrepresented among the ranks of the poor. Because of the current increase in unemployment, the number of people who fall below the poverty line has again increased to 25.5 million, so that the problem of poverty is still very much with us and will remain until we face up to the problem of dealing with it. Socioeconomic status and health. The top of page 7. Compounding poverty and making it more difficult to overcome is the fact that people with low incomes or are more likely to suffer from illnesses than those whose income is higher. In a recent nationwide survey, the health needs and problems of American families were studied. It was found that 44% of the more affluent families had a sick family member at the time of the survey, while 65% of the ghetto black families and 75% of the Appalachian white families reported a family member suffering from a current illness. A similar pattern emerged when people were asked if there was someone in the family who had taken sick within the last month. One third of the total number of respondents reported someone had become ill in the month, but approximately one half of the poverty families so reported. Differences in morbidity also are associated with ethnic status. The kinds of illnesses that Negroes are more likely to have are often different from those which afflict whites. For instance, the incidences of cardiovascular diseases, untreated cancer, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and diabetes is especially high among blacks. Mexican Americans are more likely to suffer from pneumonia than Anglos, and Indians have particularly high rates of tuberculosis, dysentery, pneumonia, and suicide. In spite of some of the mythology about the stress and strain of being rich, the high powered executive is much less likely to end up in a mental hospital than the unemployed black man. The link between low socioeconomic status and mental illness was first noted by the early sociologists of the Chicago School, who found that hospitalized mental patients were more likely to come from certain neighborhoods. Generations of researchers have now explored this correlation of socioeconomic status and mental health in depth. Most everyone agrees that the key to cure is early treatment. Although healthcare professionals argue that neurosis and psychosis are different, somehow people with adequate incomes tend to be diagnosed early as neurotic and are treated so that they can continue to function in society. Individuals whose incomes are lower or seldom treated early, and when they are finally diagnosed, they are classified as psychotic and are more likely to end up in large state mental hospitals. Illnesses of the poor also tend to be more serious, so that death or disability are more likely to follow than in upper income groups. Mortality rates for nation non-whites and people whose socioeconomic status are low are corresponding higher. In 1965, the life expectancy for the newborn white American, regardless of economic background, was 70.2 years. For the newborn non white, it was 63.6 years. This means that having the good fortune to be born white gives one an extra 7 years of life. The delivery of the infant is also more perilous for the non white mother. Her risk at death at delivery is 3 times that of a white mother, with the maternal mortality rate in 1966 of 72.4 per 100,000 live births for non whites as compared to 20.2 for white mothers. The this high death rate can be related to many factors, including adequate prenatal care, fewer hospitals deliveries, less contact with specialists, less adequate nutrition, and the poor general health of the average non-white mother. It is not the maternal mortality rates, but the infant rates that have received the greatest public attention in recent years, since infant death rates have been regarded as an index to the general well-being of a society. United States has for the past 50 years paid considerable attention to them. In 1950, we had achieved an infant mortality rate of 29.2 per 1,000 live births, and we were justly proud because it represented a great decline from the 1900 rate of 100 and the 1935 rate of 55.7. Our infant mortality rate in 1950 was the sixth lowest in the world, but this marked a sort of plateau. Although the rate has continued to decline, comparatively speaking, the United States looks worse as one by one the advanced nations of the world have passed us up. By 1963, we had fallen to 14th place with a rate of 25.2 deaths per 1,000 live births. In 1969, our birth our infant mortality rate was 20.8, which gave us a rank order of 16th place. In Iceland, the leader had a rate of 11.7. Several Eastern European countries, which still have mortality rates higher than ours, have shown a rapid rate of improvement. And if the present trend continues, they will soon pass us up. Table 1 shows the rank ordering of the major countries. And so here's that. There it is right there. Peace, everyone. Thank you for being here and reading Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare with us. We're in chapter 1, and this is what we're doing. This is very well needed and very, very key information here because We're looking at how it was back then when this book was written in the early 1970s. So we can look at where we're at now and correlate. And so that's why this book, I think this is why you guys all chose this. It's a wonderful read. All right. The question that must be asked is why the decline in our position relative to other countries? Since we have by far the largest gross national product, the mortality figures cannot be attributed to our lack of economic development. Our higher infant mortality rate is not due to lack of medical knowledge, since our medical expertise and research capabilities are second to none. Rather, it seems obvious that our drop in comparative position is due to the unequal distribution of materials, resources, and healthcare, as well as to our system of priorities that places emphasis upon more dramatic types of health services, such as heart transplants, rather than the actual application of knowledge which is already at hand. Thus, the mortality rate for non white infants in 1970 was 31.4 per 1,000 live births, while the rate for white infants was 17.4. The black child was almost twice as likely to die as his white counterpart. The figures are comparable when income alone is used as a variable. An examination of Table 1 will indicate that those countries which have passed up the United States have several things in common. They tend to be countries with fairly homogeneous population, no steep differences in income levels, and they have some system of national health insurance which delivers adequate health care to all of the people, not just those who can buy it on the open market. And the United States, in spite of the fact that illness is likely both to be more common and to lead to death and disability among the poor, medical care for low income people is inferior in both quality and quantity to that received by the more well to do members of society. During the fiscal year ending in June 1967, it was calculated that the average American saw a physician 4.3 times, including home, office, and hospital visits. People with family incomes of less than 5,000 and non whites as a group average 3.1 visits. One reason for the disparity is the fact that the practicing physicians are sparse in poor residential areas. For example, the South Health District of Los Angeles, which includes the area where the Watts riot took place in 1965, contained 65 physicians, or a ratio of 45 physicians per 100,000 population. The nearby Southeastern District had an even lower ratio of 38 doctors per 100,000 population. The total Los Angeles County ratio was 127 physicians per 100,000 persons, or about three times the number found in the poorer areas. A shortage of doctors in the areas of the highest illness is undoubtedly due in part to the fact that most physicians find it more profitable to practice in affluent neighborhoods, but the long tradition of discrimination against minority candidates in medicine and the related health professions cannot be overlooked as an important factor in the situation. Peace, everyone. Thank you for reading with us. Highest heart, love. Thank you. Quite obviously, persons below the poverty line cannot usually afford the services of a private physician in any case. So the hospital, outpatient facilities, and emergency rooms serve as the basic source of essential medical care for them. Unfortunately, as the cost of medical services has escalated, private hospitals have a necessity curtailed their charity. Hospitals with medical school ties have substituted teaching beds for charity beds, and this has led to further discrimination. Interns and residents are attracted to those institutions which best guarantee them interesting and challenging cases with which to perfect their skills. Inevitably, indigent patients with unusual illnesses can be treated free by a resident or intern by highly specialized teachers, but if the poor man's diagnosis is less interesting, he has little chance of care in a private hospital. Peace. Hi, heart love. Thank you. Oh, right. Amazing data. Hi, is heart love. Thank you for reading with us. We're almost finished this chapter. The result has been an increase in the patient load of the tax supported hospitals, often without a corresponding expansion of facilities or staff. The physician in the typical county hospital diagnoses and treats a patient is at best a resident, or not infrequently, he is a medical student or intern, since even the resident is supposedly still in training. We have a healthcare system in which poor people are reduced to the status of clinical material so that young physicians can gain experience in order later to treat their own private patients. Medical care for the poor is also fragmented care. Preventative health care, including immunizations, prenatal care, and well baby care, is not infrequently furnished to the public in clinics run by health departments. But usually, these clinics do not treat persons who are ill. This means that when the patient does go to the hospital, because he is sick, there is no medical record that can be used to assist in diagnosing his illness or to understand his background. All of the personnel at the institution are strangers to him. If he suffers from chronic or recurrent illnesses, he may become well acquainted with the nursing personnel, but rotating interns move as often as every month from one clinical area to another. Under these conditions, the close doctor patient relationship, so valued by American medicine, becomes little more than a myth. Some poor people accept this system without complaint because they have no choice. But some patients withdrew from treatment. As one 73-year-old patient explained to her social worker, I ain't going back because the last time I was there, they had 12 boy doctors looking at this leg. I ain't no guinea pig. Others are more willing to accept the system but still find it impossible, as did a mother of four who we reported. I went there at 9 a.m. like they said. About 12:30 I saw the doctor and he said I was in the wrong clinic. I went to the other clinic and waited until 2 p.m. and there were still people in front of me. The kids get out of school at 2:30, so I had to leave. No, I don't blame them. That's just the way it is if you're poor. Changing nature of medical care. The poor of the American have been part of the American scene, but their healthcare problems have become much more serious in the last few decades. One of the reasons for the growing seriousness of the problem is the rapid, almost revolutionary changes which have taken place in medicine. Since the turn of the century, the nature of the medicine has changed from being more or less custodial to materially assisting in the cure of the patient. During the same period, hospitals changed from least um, eleemosynary institutions run by religious or charitable bodies to centers of scientific medicine, and some of them have even become profit making institutions. Such changes have also modified the relationship of the doctor to the patient. And at the turn of the century, doctors had a one to one relationship with their patient, and it was not unusual for the local physician to vary his fees according to the economic circumstances of his patient. Moreover, the qualifications for becoming a physician were not particularly arduous or time consuming, and the doctor's income was not proportionately much different from that of a grocer or the other small businessman. This meant that physicians were likely to live in all parts of the city, although the wealthier ones undoubtedly lived in the higher income areas since their wealth came from serving upper income patients. Childbirths was most likely to take place under the supervision of the midwife, and in the care of the critically ill, the nurse as was as important as the physician. Slum dwellers or poor people in the city never saw a doctor until they were seriously ill, and then they were likely to depend upon a charity hospital for care. In fact, hospitals were regarded as places for poor patients to go, and they were often attached to a medical school or had a number of volunteer physicians who donated their services. Well to do people were treated in their own homes under the supervision of a private duty nurse. During the course of the 20th century, more and more of the medical tasks became institutionalized. Childbirth, which previously had been centered in the home, moved into the hospital. Developments in anesthesia and obstetrical trickle surgery and special equipment had better aseptic techniques, as well as the changing nature of the American family, all contributed to the move. So did the invention of the incubator, as well as other devices for infant care that could only be found in the hospitals. Scientific breakthroughs of the 19th and 20th centuries made operative wounds less prone to become infected, and hundreds of new surgical techniques were developed, allowing the surgeon to operate on the chest, brain, heart, and other parts of the body that earlier would not have been probed. In addition to the improvements in asepsis and anesthesia, the perfection of transfusion aided the development of surgery. With the development of rapid frozen section method, surgery also became a diagnostic tool. The invention of X ray equipment, the electrocephalograph, the radioactive isotopes techniques, and numerous other tools for treatment and diagnosis led to greater and greater concentration of patients in the hospitals in order to make better use of the investment required to operate such equipment. Further encouraging the growth of hospitals was the development of health insurance, which was primarily an innovation born during the Depression of the 1930s. Health insurance in the United States usually only paid for claims incurred during hospitalization, and many diagnostic and minor surgical procedures that could have been performed in the doctor's office were transferred to the hospital. Education for physicians was upgraded. The length of training was increased, while proportionately the number of the doctors in the population was deliberately decreased, and physicians' income grew rapidly. Whew. Most of the changes in the nature of training were initiated by the American Medical Association in the conscious effort to upgrade both medical services and the income of the individual practitioners. This is key, guys. Peace, peace. Yes, healthcare proliferating is crazy. It is sure is. Peace. Hi, it's hard love. Read it with us. It sure is. Whew. This is deep. Most of the changes in the nature of training were initiated by the American Medical Association in the conscious effort to upgrade both medical services and the income of the individual practitioners. As a part of the effort, medical schools themselves change. Fewer and fewer medical schools utilize the county hospitals as the main source of guinea pig patients and instead moved on to the university campuses where teaching beds replaced charity beds. Interns and residents found a growing variety of hospitals that wanted their services, and in order to compete, county hospitals had to pay for their medical staff. Developments in medicine coincided with similar changes in nursing. In the years following World War II, the nature of hospital training school changed as more and more nurses went to collegiate or community college schools of nursing. In the period before World War II, the vast majority of hospitals had been run by student nurses who received little more than their board, room, and education for their work. With the upgrading of nursing schools, hospitals were no longer able to recruit a supply of underpaid student laborers, and increasingly, professional staffs replaced student nurses. This meant that hospitals had to pay for their staffs, and the cost of hospitalization rose accordingly. These and other changes in medicine and nursing led to a growing crisis in the medical care. Add to them the disabilities inherent in discriminatory system, and the crisis reaches epidemic proportions. Unfortunately, the United States has never developed any comprehensive plan to deal with the medical crisis. In fact, the whole history of medical care of the poor in this country indicates that there has not ever been any well thought out plan, but rather health programs have taken the path of least resistance. In most of cases, such programs did not take into account the welfare of the poor patients as a prime consideration. Even the public health measures in the United States have most often been instituted in those areas which concern middle and upper class Americans, and not to satisfy the health needs of the poor. The fact that American public health has concentrated in the area either of the the least resistance, or that which is most popular to the middle and upper income groups, is evident from the emphasis given to sanitation, immunization, and epidemiology. Once the contagious nature of certain diseases was established by such men as Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, it was relatively easy to convince citizens and taxpayers to support wide scale sanitation and immunization efforts, if only because it was obvious that infectious diseases spread to all segments of society. Though the poor benefited greatly from such programs, it was the fact that immunizing the poor child cut down the spread of disease to the middle class child, which was made which made such measures so politically potent. Mm. The middle class bias in control of contagious disease is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the types of diseases which public health officials work the hardest to control. This is key. Whatever they put in the most work to try to control, mm, mm, mm. Poliomyelitis is a good case in point because it was probably more likely to leave its crippling after effects in the richer areas than the poor. This was because in crowded urban slums, the disease was quickly passed around so that children had frequent exposures while they were young and often developed mild cases which gave lasting immunity without the crippling after effects. Middle and upper class children who were more protected tended to contract the disease at a later age and were often likely to be permanently crippled, as was so dramatically demonstrated by the case of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Following President Roosevelt's lead, money was raised by the March of Dimes to finance a vigorous research program as well as to buy equipment and give treatment to poliomyelitis victims. Ultimately, the program led to the Salk and indirectly to the Sabin vaccines. Tuberculosis research and therapy, on the other hand, received very little public support. Although it was a far more dangerous disease, it had that in that had it had killed 33,633 people in 1950 compared to poliomyelitis, which killed 1,686 people. Tuberculosis, however, was a disease which mainly stayed in the slums, where it killed rather than gave immunity. Tuberculosis today is still common among the less affluent minority groups such as Indians, Mexican Americans, and Negroes, but it is not very common among affluent whites. This is not to say that the public health movement has focused on certain diseases or problems out of any malicious neglect, but simply that funds and resources are limited. The problems are vast, and it is politically feasible to concentrate on some things to the exclusion of others. When poor people are recipients of programs designed specifically for the poor, the recipients of programs the emphasis is usually either consciously or unconsciously in a non controversial area such as the care of infants, pregnant mothers, or crippled children. In many cases, these programs, most of which were established in the 1930s, took over existing charitable enterprises which had already focused public attention on the problem. It was also easy for public health programs to enter into areas where public institutions already existed, such as the school health program. To set up brand new institutions to deal with health problems was much more difficult to accomplish. The result is that medical care for the poor today is very spotty. Pregnant mothers and, well, babies receive the most attention. School children are the focus of some programs, and the advent of Medicare. Senior citizens also receive some care. People with rare diseases receive outstanding care because they are of interest to medical schools or to help hospital staffs, which have teaching beds at their disposal. For the rest, however, even with Medicare and Medicaid present, medical care is inadequate. The factors present in the current crisis in healthcare will receive somewhat more detailed analysis in this book, but obviously the answer to the crisis involves a rethinking of our whole healthcare delivery system. And that concludes chapter 1. Woo! There it is, baby. Chapter 1, complete of poverty, ethnic identity, and healthcare. Thank you for reading with me. Hi, it's Heart Love family. I want you to have a wonderful day. I will see you soon. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for your time. And keep sending in those the love and the questions. I love seeing something light up on my phone and it's a question or you just chiming in. I really, really appreciate y'all reading this. This is a very powerful book, and especially what we're going through. The healthcare system needs to be checked, and I love y'all. Thank you all for the love and sending love anytime. Emails, PayPal, Cash App. It's all love. Y'all have a wonderful day. Peace, peace. Yes, that's love. Y'all the best, man. Peace.